Members, I'll call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr. Speaker, Dean's Bush, with its remnant of Kahikatea forest and the Dean's homestead since 1843, is a very important Christchurch city asset, one of many such assets in Christchurch that should be preserved for future generations. Its importance is in the bush area itself, the last Kahikatea remnant in the built-up area of the city, in the house with its Victoria wooden architecture, and of course an important part of the history of the city, having originally been the Dean's homestead. This property has been well cared for, but only since about 1990, using Christchurch City ratepayers' money, and that needs to continue. This bill will see that it does. Before that, the property had been in a bad state and the bush had not been well protected. The early 1990s were the first time that the Christchurch City Council committed adequate funding necessary for the preservation of this house and grounds, including the bush behind it. As a member of the Council from 1989 to 2004, I was one of the councillors who committed voluntarily the funding necessary to make sure that the past regime of neglect all changed, and that what we see now is a property that we can all be proud of despite the current earthquake damage. During the same period, I was also a member of the Canterbury Museum Trust Board, and that was earthquake strengthened during the same period, especially the 1872 wing. I recall that it was in a sad state too. In fact, it was in such a sad state that a good sneeze, let alone an earthquake, would have brought it down. So a lot of work and a lot of expense had to be expended to make sure that it was preserved against earthquakes, in particular much stronger walls. In addition, I set up and chaired a council subcommittee to save the old government building behind Cathedral Square. In due course, it was purchased by the council for a few $100,000. It too was strengthened against earthquakes and sprinklers added, and then it was resold with protective covenants and is now the Heritage Hotel. All these buildings, including Riccarton House, survived the recent earthquakes with minor damage, in stark contrast to other Christchurch heritage buildings. And I'd like to mention three of them. First of all, the Provincial Council Chambers, which for many years was under the wing of the Canterbury Regional Council, which during those years did absolutely nothing whatsoever to strengthen it against earthquakes. The Anglican Cathedral in Cathedral Square, and under its ownership by the Anglican Church Property Trustees, did very little to strengthen that building against earthquakes, even though it had been seriously damaged in previous earthquakes. Obviously, they didn't really have the funds necessary for the purpose. The Arts Centre was an ongoing project for earthquake strengthening, and that came from public funds, mainly Christchurch City Council funds too. We did the work as a council on Riccarton House, the Canterbury Museum, the old government building and the Arts Centre and other such heritage buildings because we knew, as citizens of Christchurch, that that work was needed, and we knew that it was valued by the people of Christchurch and that they would have it for posterity. Mr. Speaker, that work has paid off, as is now evident following the earthquakes. This bill will help to ensure the ongoing maintenance of the house and Riccarton Bush. Riccarton House and Riccarton Bush. But what about other Christchurch heritage buildings? The Minister in charge of Canterbury earthquake recovery has powers, and Sarah has powers under the Sarah Act to ensure that buildings like Riccarton House are preserved and ultimately restored in whole or in part. Heritage issues are not just the elephant in the earthquake recovery room, they are a herd of mammoths in the room. New Zealand governments have always been tardy at assisting with earthquake strengthening of heritage buildings. and they are now tardy about recovering and preserving those buildings most needing it, and there are many of those. I have asked questions for written answer of the Minister in charge of Heritage and got a worthless smart aleck reply which shows only that he should not be the Minister in charge in Heritage because he clearly hasn't got a skerrick of interest about the subject at all. He'd be better to resign. That would be the most positive thing he could do. I understand that Sarah has a draft policy on heritage buildings for Christchurch, and I understand that the Minister is happy for it now to be released. But why has it not been released, Mr Brownlee? Why has that draft policy not been released? All Christchurch people want to know what Sarah's and the government's policy is about these buildings. It is high time we found out from the Minister in charge. So this bill is great for Riccarton House, but what about all the others in much more urgent need of attention? In particular, what about the Christchurch Anglican Cathedral? Why is that different from Riccarton House? Jerry Brownlee has said, in answer to a question for oral answer, only that it is a matter for the church. But that's not correct. Like Riccarton Bush and House, for which there is a trust board, there is also one for the cathedral. So why no action on the most important building in the city, the Christchurch Cathedral? It obviously can be preserved in whole or in part. The whole Canterbury community contributed to its construction and maintenance, including a lot of council ratepayer funding. The Minister and Sarah must act now to apply the funding they have to save the cathedral and in due course to see that it's restored, at least in part. I and many other Cantabrians want answers from the Minister on this, not just on Riccarton House. I and many others want to see the 2003 Act, which empowers the Anglican Church property trustees and covers the cathedral, to be amended so that in return for government funding, in addition to insurance money, donations and contributions from elsewhere, there would be an act very much like the act now under discussion covering Riccarton House, so that the cathedral could then be restored, owned in trust for future generations, used as a multi-faith facility and for concerts and other public events. If it works for Riccarton House, Mr Speaker, it will work for the cathedral. But instead we have heard nothing but silence from the Minister and from Sarah. It's not good enough. I want to hear now, and the public wants to hear now, what's going to be done. The alternative is for the cathedral to remain in its current trust and for it to be demolished for want of funding, a tragedy for Christchurch, Canterbury and New Zealand, and an indictment on this government and this generation as a whole. Returning finally to the Riccarton Bush Amendment Bill now before us, that should obviously be supported. The reservations that New Zealand First had when the bill was first introduced relating to some aspects of the financial plan have been solved with the recent amendments to section 23(3). So with those amendments, New Zealand First is happy to support the bill, but we wait in expectation for what will be done about the real problem in Christchurch, all of those heritage buildings, most particularly the cathedral, for which we have had nothing but silence, silence and silence, and for which action is now needed.
I call Maggie Berry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise with pleasure to speak to the third reading of the Riccarton Bush Amendment Bill. I have spoken